Hello, this is DC Hammer, and this is the DC Hammer Show. So as you may know, President Trump is over in Vietnam and meeting right now with leader Kim Jong-un of North Korea. But did you know that before he started meeting with the North Korean leader, he actually began talking to representatives of Vietnam as United States firms are signing deals worth $21 billion. The CEO of Boeing, along with leaders of other American companies, are using this opportunity to seal deals with the Vietnamese in order to project business for both nations. And I'm sure the Marxist screaming media has informed you that this would be in the tune of $21 billion and would support over 83,000 American jobs, either retaining current employees that are running out of things to do at some of these companies like Boeing, or creating new jobs for this work to be done. In addition to Boeing, Sabre Corporation, if you've flown anywhere on the planet and you've picked up a phone and called a travel agent and gone through the booking system, you've probably used Sabre Corporation's technology. That's a lot of what the booking system around the world uses, Sabre Corporation software. And so the combination of buying jets and the technology for people to get on those jets, we're talking about a chunk of change and a considerable number of American jobs. And so President Trump and Vietnam's Prime Minister Nguyen, I'll just call him Nguyen, I'm not going to say the last name, Nguyen, and then there's a last name there. It was a party that was a gathering that was hosted and deals were struck, and once again President Trump waved his magic wand and those jobs just keep rolling in. The Vietnamese, after decades of isolation after the war in Vietnam, and they hunkered down just to do their little communist things, now have rolled out and decided that it's probably better to be a part of the world economy and to be a producer of goods in manufacturing, since they do have a populace that's willing to work pretty cheap, but can be pulled up by their bootstraps by arrangements made with American companies to open manufacturing abroad and for the Vietnamese to benefit from goods that we have to offer. The China trade talks are going along, and President Trump has extended the deadline for imposition of additional tariffs on the Red Dragon if they don't come up with a deal regarding leveling the playing field on trade. And as Chris Chappell from China Uncensored brings to our attention, though, regardless of whatever they sign on the dotted line, whatever they agree to face-to-face, whatever piece of paper is struck between them, you have to be wary. It's one of those trust but verify things. Let's listen to how Chris explains it.
Make a promise and then break it. According to economist Arlan Suderman, China will say what needs to be said to get a deal, suggesting that Chinese leaders will promise anything, no matter how unrealistic, just to buy a bit of time with no intention of actually following through. Already there's signs the Chinese side might not follow through on its end of whatever bargain gets made.
And so the downside of dealing with people like the Red Dragon, the Red Chinese, and this is the same issue that Reagan had during the 80s, when he was trying to come to a resolution with a lot of nuclear missile reduction issues, was then, again, that's where the trust but verify term came from. And that is that the communist governments are pretty much willing to sign anything without any intention of abiding by it. It isn't that much different from the Islamic states like Iran and their unwillingness to do whatever they agree to. That's why that Iranian undeal was totally one-sided, and Iranians had no intention of doing anything in order to keep up their end of whatever in the world it was supposed to be that Kerry and Obama were trying to get from the Iranians, other than just here's your $150 billion gift. But back to the China issue, let's continue on with Chris's explanation of what's going on here.
On Monday, Chinese state-run media Xinhua suggested they might go back on the deal, saying that the emergence of new uncertainty cannot be ruled out. Uncertainty like Xi Jinping had his fingers crossed behind his back the whole time. Maybe that's why, according to multiple insiders, one of the key sticking points in the trade talks is a mechanism to force Chinese authorities to keep their word.
And there it is. So getting the other party, in this case the Red Chinese, the Red Dragon, to keep its word can be a real challenge. And it'll be interesting to see how Peter Navarro, who's the number 2 in these trade talks to Robert Lighthizer, our main trade representative. Peter Navarro has been tracking for decades how the Red Chinese, the Red Dragon, has used its nefarious means to capture elites, to force American companies to transfer technology to them, to grab our military secrets by bribing and coercing those captured elites, and taking a variety of other measures. Peter Navarro has a chart that just tracks all of the different attacks that China has launched against other countries in the world, specifically the United States, to get its way. And that's what this is all about. Whatever they sign on paper, there's got to be a mechanism in order to hold their feet to the fire so that they actually do what they agree to.
Is a mechanism to force Chinese authorities to keep their word. Both Reuters and Associated Press reported that American officials have been pressing hard for a strong enforcement mechanism with penalties if the Chinese regime fails to keep its promises.
And there it is. Penalties. So in the past, we've given China whatever it wanted, and some things that they probably didn't even ask for. Just ask Bill and Hillary Clinton what was going on through the 90s, Chinagate. And what they've become used to is America being soft targets and easy to bribe or coerce into doing what they want. Or maybe we'll allow their Chinese spies to drive our members of the Senate around, right? Dinosaur Dianne Feinstein. And at the same time have them work in the office for 20 years, and who knows what they were doing while they were in the office. But that's neither here nor there, and we're never going to get to the bottom of it as long as the Democrats controlling a lot of committees in Congress. But who knows what will happen after 2020. If the Republicans regain the House, maybe there'll actually be some truth-finding that'll go on with issues like that. But in the meantime, we need to be able to keep the Chinese, the Red Dragon's feet to its own fire. And if they say that they're going to do something, we're going to hold them to do it. And if they don't, then comes the stick, the penalties, and that's the only way to get them to do what they've committed to.
I'm imagining the penalties will be things like China is grounded from trading for a month, or they're no longer allowed to go to trade prom. Okay, it will actually be something like the U.S. will resume tariffs. And somehow, I don't think the Chinese side is going to be too enthusiastic about that one. That may be what U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer was referring to when he told reporters at the White House that we have a few very, very big hurdles that we still have to face.
And that's what it's all about. And Lighthizer is a realist, and so is Peter Navarro, and they understand that the Chinese will say and do anything in order to get a deal and prevent those tariffs from going into effect. So there's the rub. We need to come in with an even hand, try to create a fair deal. If we can, fine. If we can't, then there's no deal. If there is a deal, then there's enforcement mechanisms that need to be put into place. Coming to us from Epoch News, again, it's interesting that as we talk about what's going on with China and the trade deals with the United States, as if that's the only issue that we need to deal with right now with Red China, the Red Dragon, that is not actually the case. As this article brings to our attention, we may be focusing on the southern border between the United States and Mexico in order to ensure that there is a strong border security process and that that wall is finished. And that will cut down dramatically on the drugs coming into this country. But at the same time that we are doing that, and whether this is connected to what we are doing to strengthen the border or not, it is a fact of life that the Red Chinese, the Red Dragon, is not in the business of being a benevolent participant in the world economy, in open markets, and doing things above board. The Red Dragon, the Red Chinese, are also one of the top suppliers of opioids and other addictive drugs. And yeah, that will probably surprise you because, once again, you're never going to hear this from the mainstream Marxist screaming media. China now is becoming one of the largest drug pushers on the planet. And in the 18th and 19th century, they fought their own drug war within their own borders, and there was an opium crisis that was fueled by the British, keeping the population under control through drugs, which prompted the opium wars in the mid-19th century. And so there's a stigma about drugs in China. But now, with China in the 21st century and the technology that it's had since the early 2000s, and it's working its way into the World Trade Organization, as the Red Dragon has made some advances in high tech, it has also become very sophisticated in bioscience. and that is including the development and manufacture and distribution of pharmaceuticals. So the Red Dragon has made the advancement of biosciences a national priority, and what that all means is they continue to throw technology at the creation of drugs, and then they use their cunning, dragon-like guile in order to figure out how to maximize their profits and do the most damage to the outside world, most prominently to the United States, by the use of those new drugs. So just when you thought the only thing that we'd have to worry about is the One Belt, One Road initiative and the debt trap that the Red Dragon has unleashed upon the planet, it now has the 10,000 Talents Plan. Talents as in the talent and skill of Chinese citizens that have been sent abroad to study. Those people have, many of them have stayed abroad, and this is through their diaspora program. And now what they are doing is pulling many of those scientists and other educated and highly skilled people back from around the globe in order to man their labs and to teach at their universities in order to grow the next crop of Red Dragon minions. So as China continues on its path, it's the Made in China 2025 plan. It's that blueprint to dominate the world. Yes, like that little round guy with his cat. The Chinese have made their own plan in order to dominate the world, and it is just as nefarious as little characters, as characters you can see in some of the sci-fi or spy movies. And so what they continue to do is use ploys such as foreign investment as boomerangs on the West. In other words, providing things that sound too good to be true, and at the same time what they end up doing then is bringing in more willing accomplices to become additional minions and collapsing entire countries, or at least that's their goal. And part of that is their drug selling business and what they are doing with fentanyl, one of the world's deadliest and most profitable narcotics, along with other cannabis-related drugs that they then develop. And so China is using both its technology and legal structure in order to move to the next level. They've only got 6 years left to accomplish their plan to dominate the world by 2025. The Red Dragon will have enveloped the entire world into the dragon's den. And so we need to keep track of what the communist Chinese are doing in this regard as they continue to try to replace America around the world as the global leader. As long as we have President Donald Trump in office, we should be able to keep the dragon in check. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take all of the art of the deal techniques that President Trump has in his arsenal to prevent the Chinese from prevailing. And this comes to us from ChinaNews.net. And if I were to tell you a story about how two neighboring states were at odds against each other, and one had an area that they used to train and deploy terrorists, and the country next to them then became a target for those terrorists, and that country that was the target of the terrorists then went through a terrorist incident and then retaliated against the state, the terrorist state, by sending in a dozen airplanes in order to blow up the terrorist camp, and then the terrorist organization then saying that it's going to retaliate against the country that sent in the planes to defend itself. Wouldn't it sound a lot when I'm talking about the conflict between Israel and Palestine? Well, again, the Marxist screaming media is not going to keep you up on this one. This is involving the growing tension between India and Pakistan. And so Imran Khan, who's the Prime Minister of Pakistan, is continuing to up the ante on its neighbor India, and this issue is related to the training camps that Pakistan is allowed to be located in the Kashmir region that's on the border between India and Pakistan and has been disputed between those two nations for many years. And of course, even though Pakistan harbors the terrorists, allowed the terrorists to train on its territory, and then some of those terrorists were deployed, whether it was by their own edict or not, they were deployed into India and they committed a terrorist attack. When India then responded to defend itself, then according to Pakistan, that's committing an uncalled for aggression, and now Pakistan has threatened to retaliate at a place and time of its choosing. So we'll have to keep an eye on this one. We don't know what Pakistan means, whether that's distant future retaliation or if it's near time. It's interesting, though, that the Red Dragon has chosen this opportunity to call on both Pakistan and India to tone it down and to not go to war with each other. Kind of ironic that the Red Dragon, one of the biggest threats to peace around the world, is looking to other nations in its area and calling on them to be peacemakers. And yes, back in 2015, there was this undeal that was struck between Iran and the United States, in other words, by Mohammad Javad Zarif and then Secretary of State John Kerry, and then President of the United States Barack Hussein Obama, which resulted in the United States sending cargo planes full of cash, $150 billion worth, to Iran for, well, I don't know. What do you think we got in return? Doesn't seem to be anything that really resembles any kind of a reciprocal deal. What's interesting now is the foreign minister in Iran, who had been party to engineering that entire fiasco, has now suddenly resigned as of Monday without an explanation. Could this be the prelude to suspicion on the part of the foreign minister's part that whatever took place with the payments made by the United States and whatever that process was for sharing the wealth with maybe leaders of European nations and maybe some kickback to the parties that were involved in the United States to make that happen? Is it possible the foreign minister maybe has siphoned off a few shekels for himself, and maybe the blowback from that is getting ready to come his way, so he's blowing out of Dodge? It's not fully known what the scope of this is, and as it is just unwound as of a couple days ago, this will be one that we'll see what follow-ups come from this. But it really is interesting why Zarif would have resigned, and why would he have resigned right at the point in time when it looks like a lot of the misdeeds of deep state operators around the globe is starting to be revealed. I guess we'll all find out together. Interesting, isn't it, how the other day Kamala Harris, Ocasio-Cortez, and others talk about reparations for people in this country that may have had ancestors that were subjected to the heinous condition of slavery, that may have been kept against their will by others, and now, generations later, people are talking about the need to do reparations for that situation that was resolved back in 1865 by Republican President Abraham Lincoln as he released the slaves, most of whom were on plantations owned by Democrats, slave owners. Do not forget that slavery exists to this day, and slavery is one of the favorite tools of the Islamic State. And if you're familiar with what's going on in the UK, in the United Kingdom, with these grooming gangs, these groups of Islamists, Pakistanis, and from other countries, but in the UK it's primarily Pakistanis, who grab young girls, white girls, put them into bondage and slavery. We're talking about rape, torture, and even murder of those girls. And as that continues to go on, and it's allowed to continue by the deep state captured government of the United Kingdom, of Britain, at the same time, is the Islamic State continues to hold sex slaves of its own, many of them for years. And here's an example that's brought to us by the Geller report, Pamela Geller's reporting. An Islamic State sex slave who's escaped the caliphate with her 5-year-old son after 5 times trying to get away. So don't forget that the perfect model was made by the Prophet Muhammad, and these people that are members of the Islamic State are only following his model when it comes to killing the men, dumping them in mass graves, and then forcing the women that they've now captured into sexual slavery. It continues to this day, but isn't it interesting that all the outrage on the left is against acts that took place back in 1865 here, instead of 2019 elsewhere in the world by the Islamists. And as the Daily Signal reports that people continue to disagree with the Democrat narrative that there is no need for that national emergency and no need to actually finish constructing the wall down on our southern border. And the Border Patrol Chief of the United States has testified that there is in fact a border crisis. She should know. She's involved with this on a daily basis. And so U.S. Border Patrol Chief Carla Provost broke down the testimony. As for when I read this to begin with, I thought that she broke down, literally had a physical breakdown. But what she was doing was breaking down the activity in the testimony that she gave before Congress, and how what is taking place between the United States and Mexico on the border area does qualify as a national security crisis, and it's perfectly logical at this point in time to use a national emergency stance in order to solve the humanitarian crisis and to deal with the security issues at the same time. Chief Provost stated that she's been asked many times about how the current situation can be a crisis compared to what it was years ago when we surpassed 100 million apprehensions. And she says that to understand the numbers, you have to look at what's happening on the ground. And of course, the Marxist screaming media will not show you this. Of course, occasionally they send people like Jim the Acosta down to the border to do selfies along the border with little smug, shots of him acting as if there's nothing going on. But quite to the contrary, there's a lot going down there, and the chief of the Border Patrol brought this out in graphic terms as she testified before Congress, saying that every single day, 25% of her agents are diverted from their border security missions, and what they are doing is transporting and caring for family members and unaccompanied children. And what the narcotics traffickers are doing is using the mothers and children as ploys. They put these kids and these females out there knowing that the Border Patrol has compassion and will come to the rescue and will take them for aid. By abandoning their post to care for these unaccompanied minors, that opens up the border for the drug smugglers, for the coyotes and others to do what they're doing. Drugs go across, guns go across and back, and the human trafficking, including trafficking with the kids, takes place. So as thousands of the Border Patrol agents are required in order to provide the humanitarian aid that's been created by this disgrace of being one of the few countries in the world that is not protecting its borders, that hasn't completely acquiesced like the Europeans have, but other countries like Hungary and even Mexico that used to protect its borders until it realized that if it opened its borders, it could allow people coming in from the Honduras and other Central American nations just to kind of flow through Mexico and end up on the northern side of their border in the United States. But since we've sealed out that border, and now these people that intended to end up in the United States are staying in Mexico, Mexico now is starting to secure its own borders more than it has in the past, knowing that it is now the settlement target unintentionally of these people coming over, as long as we, the United States, secures its border. And this morning, a few of us were talking about what's going to happen with Venezuela and then Cuba. And this comes from The New American. The title on this article is Once Marxist Maduro is Gone, Communist Cuba is Next. So yes, we've got a crisis going on in Venezuela. There are people that are starving in the streets. Maduro, the Marxist, has followed on to his predecessor when the richest country in South America was transitioned from a capitalist society of free trade and bubbling oil that was put on the market, and many people in that country became very rich, and the middle class grew substantially. When the communists took over, and now Maduro is running the place, over this period of time in the last 10 years, all of the wealth of Venezuela has been siphoned off, and what is left now is a hollow shell. And as the people are starving in the streets, Maduro is refusing to leave, even with one of the members of the legislature, Guaido, insisting that he is now the legal head of the country. So when Maduro took over after Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Chavez is the one that led the country down the garden path into Marxism, communism. That country now, Venezuela, has become a hotbed of activity and contention between different countries around the world, such as Russia, China, the United States, and others. with different ideas about exactly how to stabilize that country, put it on a path towards recovering some of the wealth that is lost over all these years. But the purpose of this article is to say that once we do have some kind of a resolution to the day-to-day deprivation that is taking place in Venezuela, we're keeping our eye on Cuba, and the same conditions have existed in Cuba since Fidel Castro took over, and after his passing, his brother Raul has been the dictator in Cuba, that isolated island off the coast of Florida, which could end up being, within the foreseeable future, the next communist pot that boils over on the stove and will require some kind of support for those freedom seekers in that country that want to bring Cuba out of the mire that it's been involved in for the last 60 years into the family of free nations. Again, another one to keep our eye on. Thank you for watching, and God bless. And now the DC Hammer Show is available as an audio podcast. Just go to Podcast Garden or iTunes and search for DC Hammer or News Narrative Analysis Associates, NNAA.